If you're into sewing, you know that making your own clothes is inherently a slow practice, and that's not a bad thing. But have you ever been in a situation where you get invited to an important event and you say, I'll just make a dress for that. And then you get started on that dress a little late, and then suddenly you're panic sewing and it's not a good feeling, and now you're having to seam rip the sleeve of your dress that you've accidentally sewn to the hem for some reason. Listen, I've been sewing for at least 15 years, and I've found myself in that dark place more times than I'd like to admit. So today I want to share with you some things that I do that make me a more efficient sewer so I don't run out of time and find myself cutting loose threads at the event. So let's get into it. So you've seen me do this a couple times on this channel, but my number one tip is I always mark the left and right sleeves or the left and right leg. You can take this a step further and also mark the right and wrong side of your fabric if it's kind of hard to tell. This only takes 2 seconds to do, but it's so worth it in saving you time from seam ripping when you inevitably one day put the wrong sleeve on the wrong side of the garment. If I can't tell if a fabric has a right or wrong side, I will mark the wrong side with a pin while I'm cutting out my pattern pieces. My second tip is to have your ironing station set up before you start sewing. This is honestly a game changer. You really should be pressing your work as you're sewing. It'll give you such a professional finish. Honestly, when I started sewing, the biggest reason why I wouldn't iron my work as I went is because I didn't own an ironing board. But after I melted some carpet, I knew I needed to make a change. So now before I start sewing, I always set up my ironing board and my iron first. I personally don't leave my iron on the entire time that I'm sewing because my sewing room will just get way too hot if I were to do that. But my flow usually is I will pin a section, go to my ironing board, plug my iron in, then I'll sew that seam, and by the time I'm done, I can just press it and then unplug my iron. Okay, so this next tip is something new that I've been doing, and it's having 2 pairs of scissors at both of my workstations. So I like to use a pair of baby scissors to clip my threads, and I got so tired of searching for mine as I was carrying it around the room and just leaving it under like a pile of fabric or something. So now I keep one at the desk where my sewing machine is, and I keep one at my ironing board. I keep pointing over there for my ironing board even though it's not there, but that is usually where I set my ironing board up. This is also handy because let's say I forgot to plug in that iron, I could take my work over to the ironing board and clip my threads while I'm waiting for the iron to heat up. Okay, tip number 4 is chaining all your sewing and cutting it at the end. This one is gonna sound super obvious for someone who's been sewing for a long time, but I wanted to mention it in case you're a beginner and it hadn't occurred to you. And I also wanted to ask, when I chain my stitches, I find that my sewing machine isn't as likely to eat up my thin fabrics at the beginning of my stitch line. I don't know if that's specific to my sewing machine, but let me know if you experience the same thing. This next one is also pretty obvious to any professional sewers out there, but batch sewing is key if you're making a lot of the same thing. So batch sewing is just doing the same type of task all the way through all your garments. So for example, if I'm sewing like 3 shirts, I would sew the center back of all 3 of those shirts at once. Then I would sew the side seams together of all 3 of those shirts, and then I would continue to the sleeves and so on. It's just a good idea to pair similar tasks together so you don't have to do so much context switching. And I wanted to mention this because my fashion professors pointed this out to me, but you want to pair similar tasks together in general. So for example, if you're sewing a pocket to a jacket on both sides, you want to try to do each step of that pocket at the same time on both sides. So you don't want to like complete the entire pocket on one side of the jacket and then have to go back and complete the other pocket from start to finish. So these next 2 tips are about prep. So you want to read your pattern ahead of time, or if it's a self-drafted piece, you want to write down your order of operations before you start sewing. So a majority of my projects are self-drafted, so I won't have a set of instructions to go off of. And I don't know if it's undiagnosed ADHD, but if the next step in my sewing isn't obvious to me, I will sometimes find myself just staring into space until the next step comes to me. So I found that I need to write down the order of operations or the order of steps that I need to take in my sewing project to prompt me to go to the next step if it's not obvious. And this is especially true when I'm working on a project that has a lining, because sometimes it really does matter when you put that lining in. And the second tip about prep is to wash and cut your fabric ahead of time. I always find that I underestimate how long it takes to just cut fabric, so I've started allocating time before I start sewing to cut my fabric ahead of time. Actually, when I was making my outfit for my wedding reception, it took me an entire day to lay out my pattern and cut my fabric because I was trying to match the pattern across a couple of seams, and that just took time. Okay, so this next one is a little chaotic, but let's say you're really running out of time. You could just throw all your loose threads on the floor and vacuum them up at the end. It works if you're in a rush. Okay, the less chaotic version of this is just to make sure you have a small trash can nearby so you can gently and less chaotically scoop all your loose threads into that trash can. Okay, my 9th tip in speed sewing is to sew over your pins if you can. I do this all the time and you definitely will break a needle at some point, so I recommend wearing eye protection if you're doing this. Okay, so this next one is also about pins. You want to try to position your pins in a way that makes your life easier. So think about the direction in which you're sewing and how you can position your pins so you can pull them out as you're sewing easily. If it's something like a plain weave cotton, you might also want to consider using less pins or even no pins at all. But the opposite might be true for a satin weave. You might want to use more pins, and that'll actually save you time by not making as many mistakes. Okay, and this last tip is to make a muslin or a toile before you even cut out your pattern pieces. Okay, I put this tip last because I know no one wants to hear it, but you really should be making a muslin before you start sewing because no one wants to waste their time on a bad pattern or their good fabric. It might sound like it'll take a long time, but remember you don't need to do all your finishing details on your muslin. So for me, it usually takes me about an hour to do one. And the peace of mind that I feel when I know everything is gonna fit perfectly is so worth the time. So when I was speed sewing to get my reception outfit done, I knew after I'd finished my final muslin, I was like, whew, it's all easy from here. I could almost turn my brain off at that point. Okay, that's all the tips I have for you. I hope it was helpful. Please subscribe if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.